here is the last, excuse me, here is the last of the factoring videos. We're calling this quadratic form. And basically it's, if you're able to write a polynomial into the same form as a quadratic, that's considered quadratic form. So for example, you have some number maybe out front, you've got a variable or something squared plus another variable, or excuse me, a number times a variable to the first plus another number. Okay, so this is like a constant out here. This is something to the first, this is something squared. So it's quadratic form. This has that form. And the book is going to want you to write it in quadratic form. And I don't necessarily care if you write it in quadratic form, but the book wants you to. So if you're answering that type of a question, this is what it looks like. So write this in quadratic form. Basically, it's something squared plus something to the first plus some constant. Okay, that's quadratic form. So in this case, we have a 1 out front. This is going to be x squared. We have a 3 out front. And then we also have an x squared. And then, of course, we have a 2 on the back side. Now, basically, what's inside the parentheses is exactly the same. So this is going to be the same in here as the same in here. It's what you're squaring and taking to the first power. Okay, that's when you write it in quadratic form. Okay, so this is how it's supposed to be written. Now, to factor quadratic form, I typically don't write it in quadratic form first. So what I typically would do is I would go from here, I would go ahead and factor it. Instead of putting x and x, I'm going to put x squared and x squared, because they multiply to be 4x squared. I still do factors of 2 that add up to 3. So this is going to be plus 2 and plus 1. When I do the inside outside, these multiply to be 2x squared times 1x squared. They add together to be the middle, 3x squared. That's why the middle has to be, the middle exponent has to be half as much as the first exponent. And then if it is, it's in quadratic form. Okay, so this is how you factor using quadratic form. Again, if you write it in quadratic form, you're supposed to write it this way. If you factor it using quadratic form, you factor it, just like you normally would a quadratic. Okay, so let's try a couple here. All right, so here we have 2x to the 4th plus 11x squared plus 5. In this case, we are going to go ahead and try to factor it. This time we have a number out front other than 1. What we put in the first terms have to multiply to be 2x to the 4th. So I know it's going to be a 2x squared and a 1x squared. They multiply to be the first term. The two factors that multiply to be 5 are 1 and 5. Together, the middle has to add up to 11. So if I put a plus 5 here and a plus 1 here, I end up with 10x squared plus 1x squared, which is 11x squared. And so that's how you factor it. Again, if you need to write it in quadratic form, that's different. This is just factoring. Let's go ahead and factor this one. If I factor this one, I end up two terms that multiply to be x to the 6th. Well, that's x cubed and x cubed. Two factors of negative 8 that add up to negative 7 would be negative 8 and positive 1. Okay, so this is factored form so far, but the only thing of this one is the fact that if you can factor it further, you should. if you notice, this is a difference of two squares, or I'm sorry, difference of two cubes. So I should factor this further. This is the sum of two cubes, which is also factoring. So I should be able to factor that further. X minus 2, x squared plus 2x plus 4. This one, x plus 1, x squared minus x plus 1. Those are the factors of each of these. Now, something that you should also know when doing sums and differences of two cubes is this is never factorable. The quadratic part of differences and sums of two cubes is not factorable. Okay, so I know I'm done. All right, let's move on to this one. This is a 5A in the book, so you can look at that if you need to. 5A in the book, you notice that if we try to write this in quadratic form, I put an x squared here, but x squared doesn't work here. It's just x. So this is not quadratic form. Okay, this is not quadratic form because you do not have an exponent half of the first exponent. This one appears to be quadratic form. Whether we can factor it or not, of course, that remains to be seen. But let's go ahead and try to write it in quadratic form. I want to know what's being squared here, and then that same thing to the first power. Well, I know there's a 4 involved here, so that could be a 2x squared. So this part goes inside with the 2 stays on the outside. This is also a 6 times 2x squared. So actually that would be a plus 6 on the outside and a 2x squared on the inside. Plus 8. So it is being able to written as a quadratic form, but I believe I tried to factor it from here and I could not do it. It is not factorable. Basically they're saying that if you had 2x squared, let's use y though, 2y squared plus 6y plus 8, where basically the inside the parentheses is like your y. If I tried to factor this, I could take a 2 out. And I believe this does not factor. So that's written in quadratic form, not factorable, but that's not what the book was asking. It was just asking to write it in quadratic form. Okay, we are going to work on this factoring topics and techniques for the first day of 5.5, and then we're going to move on to solving the second day.